How long, oh Yahweh, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and every day have sorrow in my heart?
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Phil. Hi,
Hello.
Si. Good to have you on.
The bearded
Thank
brothers tonight, although we're not related.
All the dark hair and dark beards.
And dark shirts. By the looks, we're teamed up with our uniform.
It's good to be back on.
Yeah, new visitor, new face this time.
Yeah,
Si.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's
Thanks
good to
for
have you
joining
here.
us, Si. So over the last few weeks, we've been in and out of the Psalms. Last time we had a look at Psalm 12 with James, and tonight we're going to be thinking about Psalm 13. So sort of thinking about our title of our videos, Si, with Psalms for Challenging Times. How have you found these challenging times of lockdown, and how has perhaps Psalm 13 helped you in these challenging times?
I think it's been challenging for different people in different ways, hasn't it? I think a lot of people have struggled with physical isolation and being distant from people. And what we're going to discover as we read Psalm 13 is that David is dealing with isolation in some way as well, but isolation from God. He feels isolated from God and doesn't expect that to be what he that isn't what he expects from God, and so he's dealing with that and questioning why God is not close to him.
And the song that Phil began with was quite slow, not as upbeat as perhaps some of the previous ones. Do you think that reflects the psalm, Si?
Yeah, I think so. I think at least the bit that Phil played does reflect the part of the psalm that the lyrics were recounting. But we'll see hopefully that the way that the psalm develops. I wonder whether the song develops in the same way, but that it doesn't follow that kind of feeling all the way through as David deals with some of these issues.
Well articulated, yes. For all the songs that we use in these videos, there is the credits in the description underneath. So if you did like it and you want to see whether it does change in its tone and pitch timbre, then you can find that track yourself on Spotify or other music service. But these psalms were originally written to be put to music, and we're going to look at one of those, I think, shortly, Jord, in a couple of weeks' time, about the psalms in their original context. So it's good that you've segued us into that as well. So, Si, where does this psalm begin? Where do you want to introduce us to it?
Okay, well, if I share my screen and we can jump in there. Okay. So so we're going to be looking at Psalm 13, and to get us started, just thinking about this idea as we're reading through the psalm, which I'd like to do obviously before we start. I want us to kind of think about this question of what do we do when God seems distant, and I've no doubt that you both have experienced times in your lives when God hasn't felt close to you, and I definitely have, and we have choices that we can make in those times about how we respond to God, and the kind of where that journey takes us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to explore that journey through this psalm, and then we're going to look at this idea of 3 times 3 as we go through it as well,
Intriguing.
and just pick out some things to do with that. So perhaps if we start off by reading the psalm, and that'll get us going.
Yeah, I can read that for you, Si. Okay, Psalm 13. To the choir master, Psalm of David. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me.
Thanks, Jord. So hopefully just reading that through there, we can see that there is this kind of journey that David is going on. And what we're going to do is we're going to just briefly look at the kind of structure of the psalm and look how that reflects this journey that he's going on. So it's very easily broken up, this psalm. Actually, it's not a complicated psalm to look at, because it splits very nicely into these 3 sets of 2 verses, and each one is a different stage on this journey that David is going on emotionally, as he's dealing with this problem that he's faced with. And we find out what this problem is in this first section, which is this section where David is questioning God. He's asking God, how long will you forget me forever? It's quite clear what the issue is that David is dealing with here, that he feels forgotten by God, and he's questioning why that is. Then we come on to the middle section where David expresses what he wants from God in response to this. So he's saying, I've got these questions. This is how I want you to respond, and this is why, God. And so he's coming on to this next section, and then he finishes off with this praising section, which sort of feels quite unexpected, really. And so what we're going to do is we're going to sort of break down those sections and have a look at those together as we go through this. And does that all make sense?
Yeah, fits in nicely with the CPT, doesn't it, Jord, as well, that we've been talking about. We've got a new acronym, so the QRP, another ways of putting that. Do you want to relate that, Jord? How? Because I know you introduced the CPT concept. Do you think that matches from what you can see here?
Yeah, definitely. I think the questioning seems like the complaining element that we've got in our CPT. The requests seem to be those pleas that David make, and the praising comes across in the trust element. And I thought it was really interesting that you introduced that journey sign. It really reminded me, Phil, of that first session we did all those months back in May or June, whenever it was, where we got the 5 books of the whole book of Psalms, the Psalter, and we saw this sort of journey emotionally and spiritually of the psalmist. And it really resonated me with what Si was discussing in his opening thoughts. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Great.
Well, in terms of acronyms as well, I can provide you a few more, because lots of people have tried to break down this psalm into different ways, and I think really what it shows is that the psalm kind of is almost a pattern of how we might deal with different things in our lives. So we might not have this specific question that David has, that we feel forgotten by God, or these sort of how statements at the start that he's asking God, but we might have a different emotion that we're starting off on that journey. So maybe we're in the midst of despair, maybe we have a problem or a complaint, but then different people have kind of expressed, they start off in despair, they go to, this is what they desire, but yet they will still kind of delight in God. So there might be a problem, then there's the asking, the petition, and the praise, a complaint, a prayer, and then salvation. And I thought one of the most powerful images of this was actually a very visual picture of how this psalm develops, and that's this idea of being submerged at the start. This idea of drowning, and we're not physically drowning, but sometimes emotionally we can feel like we are overcome with the things that we are dealing with, and that's a kind of a universally felt thing, isn't it, when problems become too much. Yeah,
I thought that was really interesting, Si, because that's David in a lot of his psalms talks about drowning, and yet in the narrative we never come across an instance where David was physically drowning, as you said, but it's a universal sort of metaphor that we use for when we have those issues and problems. So that's really helpful.
It's a very kind of visceral picture, isn't it, the idea of drowning? I think to experience that must be very horrific, and we kind of put that picture alongside our emotional journey of what it feels like when our emotions are too much and are overwhelming, and just that idea then of the idea of drowning and then being able to come up to the surface to take a breath, the kind of power behind that, it makes you want to breathe, doesn't it? And that's what David is going through here. He's starting submerged and desperately clawing his way up to the surface, dealing with some of these problems, and then ending up somehow on the mountaintop again at the end. And that's a kind of really beautiful picture, and just the the freedom of being stood on a mountaintop and feeling the wind in your hair, compared to the drowning at the start. It's just such a huge journey that he's been on there, and no doubt we've felt that as well in different times in our lives, that we've kind of been in those low points, but then compared to the high points when we're feeling very close to God, or we're feeling like everything is working out spiritually for us, and we're connected and supported, and we're doing good, and the kind of comparison, the contrast between those things is very stark.
Yeah, and
It's interesting.
Go on, Phil, you go.
I was just going to say, it's amazing how it's encapsulated all of that just in these few verses, which sometimes in life the turnaround can be quicker. Other times each of those stages could be really drawn out, or sometimes you feel like submerging goes on for a long time. But I guess that's what you're going to lead into with the opening of the psalm. He's like, how long am I going to spend to this point? What are you going to say, Jord?
We'll come on to that as well, Phil, that there's kind of that point that David is still in that questioning moment, and yet he's able to kind of within that psalm still pull himself out to the mountaintop, even though it's not kind of all resolved. But we'll come on to that a bit more later.
No, I was just going to say how interesting it is that sometimes when you hit that mountaintop, obviously you've lost the breath when you're drowning, and it's like a breathtaking moment in when you're in the mountaintop and you think of altitude and all those sorts of things. So it's like they're closely linked but very different emotionally when you're experiencing those two different things, which just sort of resonated with me when you experience those two different sides.
Okay, so shall we move on then to this first section of the psalm, and we'll just have a little look at what's going on in a bit more detail. So quite obviously, to start with, we've got these this questioning and this this repeated questioning as well. So these four: how long, how long, how long, how long. It's not holding back with these questions, and I think that's, you know, straight away a really important point to pick up on, is that throughout this psalm and a lot of others, David is questioning God. He doesn't keep those kind of thoughts inside him and think, oh, I can't express that to God because I've got to just accept the way things are and keep my head down and just do my best. He is expressing those emotions to God and willing to share what's going on inside of him, and not trying to suppress those difficult things, but acknowledges them to God and makes it part of his conversation with God. And I think that's a really important thing for us to do, is that when we are going through difficult times, that we don't sort of push those things down and try and suppress them, and try and ignore them and pretend everything's okay. We talk to God about them and we express those things.
It's interesting because sorry, Phil.
Ditto. Go, Jord. Your turn first this time.
No, I was just going to say, and what you just said. So when you there's a psalm later on in 139 which talks about God knowing our thoughts are far off, so he knows our feelings and emotions. Yeah. So it's not like we're hiding anything from him by not being honest. So I think that's a really important point to make. Sorry, Phil.
No, I was going to say, dovetails nicely what you're saying, in that although God knows our thoughts, I was thinking of Psalm 62 verse 8. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. So yes, God does know what's going on, but as Sai's saying, he wants us to pour it out and let him know what's going on.
Because I think it's sort of widely accepted now that, you know, repressing our emotions and the things that we're struggling with is not the way to deal with them. You know, you kind of look at people who've been through traumatic experiences, and you know, if they're told, oh no, you mustn't talk about that. You know, you look at kind of the effects of, you know, World War II and the soldiers who came back and then were told they couldn't talk about those things, and the kind of the effects of PTSD and things like that. Not talking about our difficulties is not the way to deal with them, and I think that definitely applies with God as well. If we can't sort of explore those things and bring them before God and say, this is what I'm struggling with, then we're going to kind of be stuck in that phase, and that we'll always be trying to push them away or keep them down. I think this kind of then takes us on to our next point, of God's face. So this idea of in verse 1 there, God hiding his face from David, and now we don't, you know, what does that mean? I think it's not just something that David has kind of pulled out of thin air, that God's face is hidden from him. It's got context. If we go back into Numbers and chapter 6 here, this was part of the blessing that God kind of that God said, this is how I'm going to respond to Israel, that God would make his face shine on Israel. And so when David's saying, you know, God, why is your face hidden from me? It's because he expects God's face to shine on him. That's what he's looking for. He's looking for God to be to be being gracious to him and turning towards him, not turning away from him. And so I just think that's interesting that, you know, what's our expectation of God? Do we kind of, are we looking for God to be gracious to us and making his face shine on us? Or do we just kind of, you know, we don't really notice whether God's hiding his face or not, because we're not really looking at him. And David here is he's searching for God, and so he's feeling it when he doesn't feel like God's there for him. Yeah,
that is quite a powerful metaphor that came up at the end. I remember of Psalm 11. For the Lord is righteous; he loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. That's one we did recently, and I think, George, we've even got planned in a dedicated session looking at God's face in the Psalms, so to speak, because it is such a big idea.
Yeah,
and then section on enemies then, Si.
So with enemies, I think. Well, I mean, who's your enemy, Jord?
Well, I think myself at times, to be quite honest.
I think, you know, many of us would agree with that. Our own worst enemies tend to be ourselves. I think my thoughts there was that we don't really have enemies in the same necessarily in the same way that maybe we might imagine David having enemies. You know, he was, you know, actually in fear of his life a lot of times. I don't think I've ever been in fear of my life. And so how do we then think about this? You know, how long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Well, I think the things that work against us are the difficulties in our lives, aren't they? You know, the situations that we find ourselves in, maybe even the emotions themselves, like George saying, you know, the bits inside us that kind of crush us down, and that's sort of feeling like it's the biggest thing in our lives is the worry that we might have about something, and that's being exalted over us and pushing us down. I just think here, even though we might not have specific enemies that we're kind of feeling are exalted over us, we can kind of see this in the way that David's kind of going through this emotional journey, and his emotions are pushing down on him as well. You know, how long must I have sorrow in my heart all the day?
And you can definitely feel like that with guilt as well, can't you? So one of those other things that, you know, as you said, with difficulties, which, you know, can feel like it's exalted over us and weighing heavy down on us. And it talks a lot about that in the New Testament, with how Jesus has, you know, taken that burden away from us, and how we have a hope through him.
Okay, so then we move on to this middle section of the psalm. So we've got kind of all this questioning going on in the first part, and then we've got this kind of section on requesting, and I think this is quite important to think about, that when we are talking to God, that we think about what our motivation is, and I think this is where David is justifying to God. This is why I want you to answer me, God. So he's not just demanding things and saying, you know, how long. He's then saying, this is why. You know, we've got this repetition of the word lest there, in verse 3 and 2 in verse 4. Lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, lest my foes rejoice. He's saying to God, this is why I feel justified in questioning you, and in questioning what's going on. How long is this going to last? For these reasons, and I think it's important for us to do that when we are talking to God, that we do question our motivation, when we think about why we are asking the things that we are asking, just to raise the level of that conversation from something that's just going on in our own heads, something that's just very much an internal kind of grumbling or questioning of things, and in actually presenting it to God through prayer or expressing it, it forces us to bring that conversation up into a spiritual place where we might actually have to justify to God some of the reasoning why we're asking for the things that we're asking, and that forces us to be a bit more introspective, rather than just kind of this sort of underlying low-level grumbling which we might have about, you know, this situation or this, you know, despair that we find ourselves in. We actually bring that to God, and we're told that we can have confidence to do that. In Philippians chapter 4, we're not told that we sort of should be anxious about bringing things before God and sort of presenting those requests. It says, the Lord is near, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, so that's both, you know, in joy and in despair, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving present your requests to God, and the peace of God which transcends all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so I think that's what David is doing here. He's presenting these requests to God with confidence, and also justifying why he thinks those things are important.
It's a bit similar to the other week film. We're thinking about David and how he sort of thought about himself being righteous, and how we looked at those verses in Romans, didn't we, in regard to that, which is similar to what you've been talking about, Si, with that aspect of being justified by God, and that confidence that we can have, which is really special and encouraging to think about, isn't it?
And just generally, it's helpful to know that even if someone faithful like David struggled with that, then so what, we will be valid to have that as well ourselves.
So what's the third lot of three, Si?
Yeah, so this is our 3 times 3. So the third lot of 3, we move on to this, as I said, kind of unexpected part, really, that Dave is going through all these difficult questions and justifying why he's asking these things. But then suddenly the psalm almost switches around, and we get this you know, I have trusted in your steadfast love. And we've got this kind of, even though, and we mentioned this just a bit earlier, even though he's still in the midst of this questioning and this wrestling with this problem, he's making a decision here. He hasn't had an answer to this kind of prayer or this plea. He's still in the midst of it, but he's already making a choice on how he's going to respond. And I think that's really important for us to be able to do as well. But once we've laid our emotions out before God, and once we've laid our struggles out, that we have kind of brought ourselves to a place where we need to acknowledge that that we might not get an answer straight away, or we might never get the answer that we think we want, but we have to make a choice, and we've got to choose in every situation what we're going to do with what God has put before us, or with what life has put before us. And here David makes a very clear choice, even though there's all these things going on. He says, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. And it's really powerful to see what David's done here. You can see him taking that step and pulling himself up onto the mountaintop here. He's taking that breath, and one of the best ways of doing that is by rejoicing in salvation, and also in remembering what God has done. He said, like at the end of verse 6, he says, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So he's come out of this place where he's questioning all of these things and saying, where are you, God? You're so far from me. But then at the end of verse 6, he's saying, you've dealt bountifully with me. So he's looking back and remembering, actually, there are times when God has dealt bountifully with me. And we see this again in Psalm 77 here, where David's going through a kind of, I'm not sure actually if, I didn't check if that was a Psalm of David. Maybe we can just check that now. But the psalmist
Asaph,
is
this one is, but
Asaph, okay.
very similar.
Yeah. But going through that same pattern, asking these questions, will the Lord reject forever? Will he show his favor again? Very similar to that, showing his face. And then further down, then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on your mighty deeds. So the response to this despair and this questioning and struggle is to lay it before God and then remember what he's done. And I just think that's a really powerful pattern that we can take into our own struggles and into our own emotions, our own emotional difficulties, and say, well, I'm not going to get an answer to this immediately, or maybe not the answer I want, but I'm going to choose to trust and remember that God has given me salvation. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. And so really that brings us to the end of that kind of journey with David. And that's our kind of takeaway point, that when God seems to be distant to us, we have to call out to him and then choose to trust in his unfailing love. And so we've kind of seen that journey through this psalm that David's been on. And I think it's about making that choice, it's and in pouring out our problems to God, it almost makes it easier to make that choice, because we've taken ourselves out of the point where we're just doing the questioning and just kind of struggling. We pour it out to God, and that enables us to get to that next level, enables us to break the surface and then climb to the mountaintop, and trust in what God's done for us.
Wow, such intensity of emotions in 3 different sort of stages, isn't it? That I really like that point that you've left us with, that God might seem distant, but we call to him and trust in what he's done and his unfailing love. I think Jord's going to explore that in a future session, aren't we, Jord? What that unfailing love really means, isn't it?
I was literally just about to say, yeah, God willing, next time we're going to think about that phrase, steadfast love, in the book of Psalms. So that's led us beautifully into that side. So thanks for that. And thanks for those, that 3 times 3. I think that's really helpful to think about in prayer and in life when it's challenging, and working and grappling through that with God is a really worthwhile thing in growing and leveling up, and trusting and being able to rejoice in the salvation that he's provided. So thanks for sharing those thoughts.
Thank you.
I found it useful to go through that process, and I think it's good to have those practical examples of seeing David's emotional journey, because we will be going through that journey as well.
And if you too, who are watching this video, struggling at a different point in your journey, maybe you're feeling in the ocean, or just made it to the surface, or maybe on that mountaintop, hopefully you've found something that you can connect with God from this psalm. So thanks everyone, and thank you for watching. God bless, and I hope to speak to you again soon, God willing. Bye for now.